I'd like to welcome everyone to the Northern Institute's Social and Policy Research Platter. We're celebrating Research Week at CDU this week, and this is our contribution. My name is Katrina Britnell, and I'm the Partnerships Coordinator with Northern Institute. Firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet today, and for us at Northern Institute in Darwin, it is the Larrakia that we pay our respects to. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us. I ask that you keep your microphones muted, but I think it already may be set that your microphones are muted for the webinar. And if you have any questions, if you could please leave them to the end of the presentation when we ask for questions, that would be great. Otherwise, we might lose them if you do them throughout the presentation in the chat. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Gill Westhop, who is going to present for us today from sunny Tasmania. Okay, Jill, take it away.
Thanks, Katrina, from cloudy Tasmania, I'm afraid. I too would like to acknowledge the Larrakia people as the traditional owners of the land on which Charles Darwin University sits, and pay my respects to their owners past, present and future. I'd also like to extend my respects to all Indigenous people attending this event, regardless of the area or the country in the world from which they come, and pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples of all lands, of all participants in this event. I'd also like to acknowledge the organisers of Research Week and thank them for the opportunity to present this webinar, and also acknowledge World Vision, and in particular Wahana Visi, which is World Vision Indonesia. They're the organisation who provided the case study that I'm presenting today. And I'd also like to thank World Vision International, who organised for there to be a realist evaluation of this particular project, and World Vision Australia, who contributed to funding it. The purpose for this presentation today, and I'm about to start sharing my screen so that you can see what it is that I'm talking about. The purpose of my presentation today is to examine a little bit, provide one case study of research impact during CDU Research Week. This particular piece of research is an evaluation, in fact, and so I'll be looking at it through an evaluation lens, but many of the morals of the story are applicable to research as well as to evaluation. In order to be able to look at the research impact, I'm going to firstly introduce very quickly a very broad theoretical framework for use of evaluation findings. I'm going to do the quickest, dirtiest ever introduction to realist methodology and what it is. And all the people from Ramesses who are online, I know it's quick and dirty. Then I'm going to just very quickly introduce the case study, talk a little bit about the use that we know of so far for this particular study, and then start to talk about or think about some of the how, why and in what contexts of the impact. That how, why and in what context is kind of a realist framing for thinking about the evaluation or the use of this particular evaluation. I felt a little bit uncomfortable putting this evaluation forward as a case study because the fact that it has been used might mean that it's seen to be boasting, but actually as we move through the ways that it has been used, you'll find that an awful lot of the credit actually lies with other actors. We in RREALI, the Realist Research Evaluation and Learning Initiative, where I work at Charles Darwin, are taking as much learning from this example about what we haven't been doing as a matter of course, but that we should be doing more of, as anybody else might. We do also think that the methodology itself has contributed to the use of the evaluation, so I'm going to talk very briefly about that. Everybody who's ever gone to anything about public speaking knows you're supposed to start with a joke, and it's not my strength, but my son recently sent me this fabulous cartoon, and it led me to ponder on the fact that there are probably two reasons for putting this up. The first one is that when we're thinking about realist work, we are always thinking about causation. And realist research and evaluation methods are methods that are designed to get at causation when causation usually isn't visible. And the second thing is that we might wish for research impact or for our evaluation findings to be used, but if all we do is publish an article about it and put it out there in the world, that might be a little bit like a shooting star. And to push the analogy a little bit further, there's a very big universe of journals out there, and there's an awful lot of noise and dust and hot air involved. So I think we need to do more than rely on what publication can do for us in order to contribute to research impact. Okay, so I want to talk very briefly about this framework for use of evaluation. Look, there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different frameworks for thinking about the use of research and evaluation, and they've got slightly different names in different sectors. Implementation science in health, for example, looks at the implementation of research into practice settings in health. But what I want to do today is draw on an older framework in the evaluation sector, which was developed by Carol Weiss. Back in the 60s and 70s of the last century, that is, evaluators were frustrated with what they saw as low levels of use, and Weiss looked into this during her PhD. The findings that she had are summarised in different ways by different people, but she identified a whole range of different types of use. So, for instance, instrumental use is the intended use by the intended users when judgments or decisions are made based on the findings of an evaluation report. Conceptual use is less direct, but it's when the ideas that are built into an evaluation or insights that are generated as a result of it are used by the program people, the program staff or the policy staff directly involved. Process use is where things that participants in the process of doing the evaluation learn are used and are developed by the participants in the process of doing the evaluation and then used by them. And those learnings don't necessarily relate to the findings of the evaluation itself. Enlightenment is when ideas are transmitted more broadly and they pass into the parlance of, the ways of speaking of, a wider audience. Legitimisation is when findings support intended or desired actions or directions. And symbolic use is when the mere fact that there is an evaluation being done focuses attention and symbolises the importance of the project or program that's being evaluated. And I put that up because when I start to think about the ways this evaluation has been used, we discover that many of those forms of use are in fact represented. A super quick introduction to realist methodology for those of you who aren't familiar with it. I'm focusing on this a little bit because I'm going to argue that methodology can make its own contribution to the utility of findings. There's a particular group of research functions or research types, literature review, evaluation, social and policy research, that all share a common underpinning philosophy, underpinning framework, which is known as the realist philosophy of science. A realist philosophy of science aims to explain how and why outcomes are caused and why they vary in different groups, for different groups or in different contexts. Or turning that around, we can say we know that context matters, and what this approach does is help us work out what it is about the context that matters for causing which particular outcomes. Realist approaches can be applied to all kinds of different domains: social, environmental, natural science, whatever you like, policies and programs. We use it primarily for social policies and programs. It's applicable at all levels of all systems in all sectors. The findings can be used to inform design and adaptation of policies and programs to context. That's an example of instrumental use. And in evaluation, what it does is frame the evaluation question from what works, or did this work this time, to what works for whom, in what respects, to what extent, in what contexts, and how. And the "and how" is the what are the underlying causal processes part of the explanation. When you apply it to policies or programs, that implies a certain way of thinking. So most forms of evaluation start from the assumption that programs cause outcomes. But by way of contrast, one of the first assumptions underlying realist approaches is that programs themselves do not cause outcomes. Rather, what they do is provide some kind of new resource, new opportunities, new constraints, which interact with the reasoning of people along the way who are making decisions. So that might be program managers or staff or participants or other stakeholders. And that interaction between the new resources or opportunities and reasoning leads to new decisions or choices which underlie changed behaviours and which then contribute to program outcomes. And that interaction between reasoning and resources is known as a program mechanism, and it's one of the fundamental things that realist work is trying to discover and unpack. But mechanisms only operate if the context is right. So there are specific things about the way programs are implemented that'll influence the outcomes that are created. But they'll also influence how people respond to the program, their reasoning about the program. There are things about individuals that will influence their reasoning, but there are things about individuals that also influence their capacities, both human and material, to respond in the ways that the program hopes they will. There are things about institutions within which both the participants and the programs reside, which will affect participant reasoning and beliefs. There are things about interpersonal relationships, both within the program, so for example between staff and participants, or between staff and management, and external to the program. For example, the levels of conflict in a community, which will also affect reasoning and responses. Now, all of those things interact with each other, but so too they interact with whether or not the opportunities and resources are available to people for them to be able to implement a decision or choice that they would like to be able to make. And so then all those things interact to create patterns of program outcomes. Realists aren't particularly interested in the average net effect. We can work it out for you and tell you if you like, but actually we're more interested in why is it that this intervention of whatever kind works for these people, doesn't work for those people over there. What do we need to do to make our program be more effective in the context for which it's intended? So with that super quick and dirty introduction to the logic of causation that underpins realist research and evaluation, I want to turn now very quickly to a particular case study. So this project was a social accountability program. Social accountability is a strategy for trying to hold governments and service providers accountable to the people, rather than holding communities accountable to governments. And this particular social accountability program is called Citizen Voice and Action, and in this particular project it was being used to improve maternal and infant child health services in 3 provinces in Indonesia, where they had very high maternal and infant mortality rates and very poor service quality. The project was funded by the World Bank, and World Vision Australia contributed to the funding for the evaluation. It was implemented across 60 villages, 30 starting in year 1 and another 30 in year 2. The project had 9 staff and it was conducted over a 4-year period. There's lots more information about this case study is available online, by the way, if you want it. The evaluation itself was realist, so it was trying to answer the question, what works for whom? What is it about this intervention that works for whom, in what contexts and how? The evaluation was concurrent throughout the life of the project. It was participatory and collaborative, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. It was deliberately building capacity in using realist research and evaluation, and it was a mixed method evaluation. And I think that every one of those aspects has contributed in particular ways to the fact that the findings have been used in the ways that they appear to have been used. And I'll come back to that again later in the presentation as well. So I said that the evaluation was participatory and collaborative. There were multiple roles played by multiple stakeholders in this evaluation, and I am pretty confident, without the evidence to support that directly, that participation has contributed to process use. So, for example, the project team were the people who did the data collection, and they also contributed to data analysis, and they translated some of the qual findings for us. There was, so there were, as I said, there were a bunch of different stakeholders, had a bunch of different roles in the evaluation, and because they were involved, they were learning. And because they were learning a range of different things, many of those stakeholders have in fact contributed to use of the evaluation after the evaluation was completed. Because it was a realist evaluation, one of the ways that realist evaluations work is that you start by developing an initial rough theory of change. How and why is this supposed to work? And then you use the data that you collect over the course of the evaluation to refine that theory. So the slide that you see now is a summary of the 8 main underlying mechanisms that we thought at the beginning of the evaluation would contribute to the intended outcomes. And I'm not going to talk you through all of them, but for each of those main mechanisms we had a set of more specific context mechanism outcome statements that specify the circumstances in which we would expect this particular mechanism, usually described in, approximately a paragraph, to contribute to the specific outcomes that it was anticipated they would contribute to. We did, over the course of the evaluation, refine each of those CMOs and end up with a lot more detail about how exactly those different levels of change worked. In order to do that, we had to collect data. And this particular evaluation, because most of the data was collected by the staff who were doing the work, we were able to collect quite a lot of data, more than we would have been able to if we'd been doing the data collection ourselves. And some of the data is actually built into the way that citizen voice and action works. So we had data from monitoring the standards that were being achieved in the health services themselves. And we could say specifically which standards they did meet and which ones they didn't in what particular locations. There was also citizen report cards, which were developed in response to the things that the citizens themselves said were important to them about the nature of the services. And so over time we were able to track change in citizen satisfaction with particular aspects of particular services. There was a household survey and an officials and cadres survey that were primarily designed to let us know whether or not people, be they residents or workers and other officials, whether they knew what services were available to them and whether they knew what should be available to them under the standards. We also used a modified form of most significant change stories in a sample of 24 of the 60 villages to find out what outcomes were attributed to the program by different groups of people in those villages, so local government, service providers, residents, volunteer workers, etc., etc. What are the outcomes that were attributed to the program? Which of those were seen as being the most significant, and how respondents thought that they had come about? We based some of those MSC stories, the selection of villages for that was constructed so that it included nested case studies of what people thought were going to turn out to be high and low performing villages, but which in fact confounded expectations somewhat. And there was also a lot of process monitoring data that was collected by the staff that enabled the staff to look at who was participating in which process, break that down by gender and a little bit by age. So it was really quite a data-rich evaluation. By the end of the evaluation, we were able to synthesise back at a much higher level of abstraction how it is and why it is that CVA improves service quality and service outcomes when it does. And one of those main overarching mechanisms was by changing power relationships, and one of them was by strengthening systems. So in the evaluation report itself, we've got very detailed descriptions supported by these somewhat summarised diagrams of how the various elements interact with each other in order to contribute to changed reasoning and or changed access to information resources that in some way change power relationships and which contribute to triggering the internal accountability systems within the health system so that, you know, authorities could require and hold staff to account for doing what they were supposed to do, for example, but also informing authorities so that they knew what the gaps or issues were in terms of service delivery, and they often didn't know that. And so they were themselves empowered, if you like, to take action to address them. The other overarching view that we developed was about how it is that CVA actually strengthens the health service system. And we identified ways in which the program had expanded the boundaries of the system so that citizens and local government were considered to be part of the system. How the various elements within the system, the broader system, were strengthened, how the relationships were established between elements of the system, and how stronger information and resource flows, including information about positive feedback loops, were established and how they managed to strengthen the system. Again, there's more detailed explanation of those in the report if anybody is particularly interested. But really that was just there as background for us to think about, well, how and why has this particular evaluation report been used? And I have to say, it came as something of a surprise to me to discover how it has been used. So the World Bank has a global platform for social accountability through which they fund social accountability initiatives, and they have their own overarching theory for social accountability, and this report was one of the inputs to their revision of their own program theory for social accountability. They also cited the report in a discussion paper on trends in social accountability. They used it for providing training through the global platform, at webinars, at an international workshop, and for health workers in Brazil, amongst other places. But it also influenced World Bank's preferred process for evaluation of social accountability, so that they are now actively asking for full cycle evaluation of the programs that they fund, which they most certainly were not doing before. And they've provided the report to other evaluators and asked them to consider it as a reference. World Vision has also provided it to other evaluators, and they are asking those evaluators to in part base their evaluations on the program theories that were developed in this evaluation in at least 2 other countries. Wahana-Visi, the Indonesian World Vision organisation, also produced a 2-page, well, it's 4 A4 pages, infographic summary, which I'll show you a bit of in a minute. They also submit the evaluation report as evidence of their work in funding applications. But the bit that was interesting to me was some of the process use. As they became more competent in realist evaluation, they became more interested in skilling up more people in using realist evaluation. And so they are extending the use of realist approaches into other projects, and they're also participating in a range of other initiatives that we at RREALI are undertaking. There are a bunch of other people who have used it in various ways for capacity building, as well as the GPSA, the World Health Organization Community of Practice for Social Accountability asked me to present on it at their last international conference. Feedback Lab tweeted it as a must-read, and we use some of the methods as examples in our own training in realist evaluation and realist conferences. So I was feeling pretty rapt about this, but I also wanted to think about how and why did this particular evaluation take off in the ways that it did, when we've done a whole lot of others that did not take off in these ways. So I made mention of the fact that Wahana-Visi had produced a 4-page summary of this, and this is the front and back cover of a sort of folded A4 size leaflet. Now, I had no part in constructing this. They did it all themselves. And it was interesting and actually gratifying to me to notice that they had included the program theories about the revised program theories that we came up with through that evaluation as part of a very short summary of what was actually quite a long report. The middle pages that you can't see here summarise the main outcomes of the projects, and they give this little folded flyer thingo out to donors and funders in meetings with them. Now, my instant hypothesis is that they were actually only able to do this in this way because it was a participatory evaluation and they understand the methodology and the methods and the significance of the theory in great depth as a result of it. As a result of it being participatory. We're also starting to actually gather up a little feedback from users about why they used it. And this, it's not me doing that work directly, but an email was forwarded to me that said, first, I found your article, that's not my article, that's somebody in World Vision had written an article about it, about the evaluation. I read the article and this sentence really stood out to me. The evidence on local power dynamics appears to advance knowledge in the field of social accountability and may be the first evaluation to make such findings anywhere. This made the evaluation sound very relevant for our audience. Many of the practitioners in our network are accountability enthusiasts who are looking for evidence in favour of shifting power. I shared the link to your article in hopes that others in our network would find the evaluation's findings useful for their own work, designing systems to shift power to local stakeholders. Now, I see a whole lot of stuff. When I read that from a realist perspective, read that quote from a realist perspective, I see a whole lot of things that speak to us about how and why this is working. First of all, it's being promoted to specific audiences who have specific interests. Secondly, the process of promotion is highlighting both the relevance and of the findings and the existence of new knowledge. But also, we see Weiss's categorisation as legitimisation in the part of the quote, many of them are accountability enthusiasts who are looking for evidence in favour. Now, of course, you can't set out in an evaluation to find particular evidence in favour of something. And there would be times where you'd actually regret that findings could be used to legitimate some decisions. But nonetheless, when findings do happen to work in support of existing positions, that may then contribute to the use of the findings. And the final bit of the quote talking about the applicability of the findings for design, that's part of what realist evaluation is supposed to be for. So that again seems to be a clue about how we need to go about promoting our work in order for people to make use of it. When we started to think about, well, why did this one take off? I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why. Firstly, this was largely a successful project, which from a realist point of view is context. And that meant that organisations, including World Vision, have been happy to promote it. And that's probably a mechanism contributing to the outcome of use. Second contextual factor is that social accountability is a widely used approach in international development, and that means that there is infrastructure within the World Bank, within the World Health Organization and so on, that is dedicated to this particular approach, and they are some of the people who are using the findings and promoting the findings for others. The third thing that I think is that revised program theory about shifting power and strengthening systems is middle range theory. It's a middle level of abstraction, which is applicable across sectors and across countries and probably across different kinds of programs. And it can therefore be used and tested in other evaluations to build a more coherent evidence base than you can possibly ever get from one evaluation. And that revised middle range theory can be used to advocate for the particular model, citizen voice and action, and used in funding applications. It can be used to improve or adapt the model in other settings. And it has meant that multiple stakeholders, including World Vision, have been happy to promote its use. The next reason that we think it's taken off is that the theory that we've developed is very much grounded in the evidence. It's supported by quite solid evidence that either hadn't been previously obtained or hadn't been systematised. And realist methodology has enabled both the collection of that kind of evidence and its systematisation within the theories. For the World Bank's use of it as advocating for a whole cycle evaluation approach, I think the mechanism there is a demonstration effect. By doing an evaluation that has demonstrated its value, by using a long-term concurrent evaluation approach, that has demonstrated the value of doing long-term concurrent evaluation, and the World Bank has picked up on that. I think there's also the credibility of World Vision as a reputable international organisation, which has meant that other stakeholders have been happy to support and promote it. And there has also been strong promotion of the report and its findings by a World Vision champion who is an expert in social accountability, who has very strong existing international networks and high credibility in World Vision, in donor organisations and in the social accountability sector more broadly. So those are some of the reasons that I think this particular evaluation has taken off. What might we do next? We really, in the first instance, do next with this? Well, we're currently developing a process to collect feedback about each of our research and evaluation projects, some period, we're not quite sure what length of time yet, after we've submitted the report, about the use to which the findings have been put. We want then to be able to analyse in what contexts, how and why our research and evaluation does and doesn't have particular kinds of impact. And one possible way, we haven't agreed a process for this yet, but one possible way for us to collate and organise our findings would be to set up a matrix with Weiss's categories of use down the left-hand side, and then a traditional context mechanism outcome table set up in which we identify the factors in the context that enable particular use mechanisms to be fired and the outcomes that follow from it. We also think that there might be some kind of morals of the story for research impact more generally, and those are to analyse the context for research impact, not just the context for the whatever it is that you're researching in itself. The second one, I think, is to consider how it is that your research methodology and methods can contribute to use and design them to do that. We don't believe as realists that evaluation is objective and independent. We believe that all evaluations are going to have some kind of impact and some kind, and therefore you may as well design for positive use. And the third thing that I would say is that it's useful to consider the basis of generalisation. In realist approaches, we generalise on the basis of portable mechanisms that work or not according to the contexts in which they are found. And that's quite different from the basis for generalisation in traditional positivist research, which says find the net average effect, and if the context is similar enough, whatever that means, then the findings are probably portable. And it's quite different from constructivist research, which says the findings are absolutely specific to this place and time and they can't be generalised. What realist methodology offers is a way of generalising that is explanatory and that helps people to then decide how they can use the findings for the particular purposes that they have, which will be different for different groups, and what the relevance is for them. At that point, I'm going to stop sharing. I think I've kept my presentation down to time, and I'll invite Katrina to take over with the Q&A.
Hi Jill, that was awesome. We have one question from Andrew Hawkins, and it is, does changing the way evaluation is done fall into one of the existing categories of evaluation use?
No, I don't believe so from my current knowledge base. It doesn't fall into one of those categories, but I think what it does is shape the categories of use that a particular evaluation might be used for. So, for example, if you do any kind of non-theory-based evaluation, you're not going to generate those portable middle range kinds of theories or findings that can be applied in different contexts to help people understand why things aren't or aren't working in particular contexts. So I think methodology shapes the kinds of use that will be made rather than fitting within a category of use.
Excellent. And we just have time for one more question, which is from Priya Khanna. Apologies if I've pronounced that wrong. And the question is, when developing a theory of change/program theory, do you consider why the components of a program may not work? Negative mechanisms, ?
Yes, indeed, one should. The way that we go about this in RREALI is that we start with the positive understanding of how the program is intended to work, because when people put policies or programs into place, they're usually doing it with good intent, and they're usually doing it because they believe it'll work. So we start by saying, okay, talk us through how you think this is expected to work and what the benefits are supposed to be. But then once we take people into stuff like who is going to respond in these particular ways, that then starts to highlight and who will not respond in those ways. And then you start to think about things like, what other responses could there be to these same sets of resources, opportunities or constraints that the program is providing, and what outcomes will they have? And so you can start to think to walk people through the process of working out what the negative mechanisms or whatever. I will finish up just by saying out loud what Katrina has just dropped into the chat list, which is that I'm very happy to talk about this more with people, but I think it would be fab if we put the questions onto the Ramesses discussion list and started a bit of a discussion about how and why realist work is or isn't used, and how we could better investigate that. And we could have a lovely conversation about that. The chat list can be joined at the Ramesses project site, and Katrina has put the address into the chat list there.
Wonderful.
All done.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Jill, for today. I think I'm frozen. Anyway, thank you for everyone for joining us. Just letting you know that we will be, we have recorded this and we will be editing it. It will go on our Northern Institute YouTube channel and Vimeo channel. It takes a few weeks, so please keep an eye out on our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, because we post there when videos are put up. Thank you very much for joining us today. Take care and see you soon. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you. And just to say that I will also put the link onto the Ramesses discussion list once it's available, so that people who heard about this presentation through Ramesses will also get access to the link.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks everyone for attending.